You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 3, Kidnapping, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 2. Guards. Any task can be done half as well in twice the time by the simple addition of a dozen members of the Royal Guard. A swarm of junior officers arrived in the morning to retrieve the lost child. 3 hounds in green to sniff out the trail left by the kid. 4 peacekeepers in blue to collect statements from the witnesses. 3 ledgers in gray to record and file all the paperwork. And a pair of Mounties in red riding a moose and a polar bear, presumably in case a war broke out. The only explanation Kuro could fathom for the size of the group was that they were incredibly bored. Rather than having nothing to do at their headquarters in the Granite Citadel, they all came along so that they could have nothing to do at the orphanage instead. Kuro flattered himself by imagining that they were overstaffed ever since his capture 2 years prior had left them with much less work. Kuro was spared the initial round of interrogations as he had the good fortune of being badly injured. Miss Brigid would not allow the hounds to get their paws on Kuro until she was certain his wounds weren't fatal. She hid him, the lost child, and the Lamorak sisters safely within the confines of the central manor of the orphanage while she tended to their injuries, leaving the guards to prowl impotently around the grounds, demanding information from children who knew nothing and were more than happy to share it. The medical ministrations took longer than necessary. All Kuro needed was a potion to speed the mending of his broken ribs, which he could have mixed himself, and a clean bandage over a few scrapes. He'd had worse injuries. The matron of the orphanage disagreed. He was not allowed to tend to his own care, nor escape a thorough examination for more serious issues, like concussions, internal bleeding, or hangnails. She was very thorough, and Kuro understood why. It was his punishment. Miss Brigid was a kind woman, caring to a fault. She was stern only insofar as needed to protect a dozen children from a dangerous world, one another, and themselves. She had few rules, all quite reasonable, and Kuro had violated most of them. He had broken out of the orphanage, at night, alone, into the wilderness, without telling anyone. He'd even crossed into the Blandlands. Under normal circumstances, he'd be scolded and heaped with chores. It was difficult, however, for the matron to justify a full recrimination when Kuro had also risked his life to rescue a child who was still present and comforting himself by squeezing the simulated life out of an imitation raccoon. Unable to navigate a balance between her fury, relief, and appreciation for Kuro's actions, she huffed and muttered to herself in half sentences like, "If you ever, I ought to, blasted luck of the unseelie, and could you kindly stop that?" while prodding him, applying unnecessary bandages, and forcing him to wear a sling. The last comment she repeated several times, but Kuro was unable to oblige as it seemed to be outside of his control. The thing she was asking him to stop was the wind. It was still blowing, trying and failing to push Kuro. The runes along the silver bangle flickered through a rainbow as gusts blasted at him from all directions. The wind rose and fell, trying different velocities and angles of attack, all to no effect. Kuro couldn't even feel it on his skin, but his clothes and hair flapped in the breeze, and it made tying bandages very difficult for Miss Brigid. Bella received a similar treatment from the matron. The girl had to admit to having a copy of the orphanage keys, which had allowed her to open the door in a hurry, and she had cast extremely dangerous combat magic, neither for the first time. The fact that she'd burned her left hand quite badly by launching a bolt of lightning without a conducting rod earned her some grace. That she had undoubtedly saved both Kuro's and the toddler's lives, only slightly more. Azalea escaped uninjured, although Miss Brigid regarded her with suspicion for having been present. She was young and frail, and should have been asleep in bed. Or at least that's what the matron insisted. She was indeed young and frail, She was a year behind Kuro in school and had all the robust physicality of a well-cooked noodle. Her flimsiness was made all the more stark when sat next to her sister. They shared dark hair and a glare that could turn back the tide, but otherwise they were perfect opposites. Bella was broad, athletic, and tanned, where Azalea was narrow and pallid and wheezed when she stood up too quickly. Kuro knew better than to be fooled by her appearance. Her arms may have been barely strong enough to carry the books she constantly had her face buried in, but she was twice the wizard of most her age. She could trade fireballs with the best of them. She'd done so with Kuro when she'd challenged him to a duel the year before. He was definitely not among the best of them, and so the exchange had been a bit one-sided. Miss Brigid, after an eternity of fussing over the children while she decided whether to scream at them or hug them, finally gave up on either and settled on a long, exasperated sigh. She picked up the lost child and abandoned the 3 rescuers to their fates. "How's your hand?" Kuro asked Bella, noticing her wincing as she moved. "It'll heal," she replied, with a sort of cockiness that made Kuro think she would have said the same of a missing limb. "Think this makes us even?" Kuro was startled by the question. Well, the two had a rocky start, with a combination of arrests, mild stabbings, and near drownings. Their past year had been quite peaceful. Kuro hadn't imagined that she would want to make any kind of amends. "Sure," he said. "More than—" "What about me?" demanded Azalea. "What did you do?" asked Kuro, who was just as suspicious as Miss Brigid of Azalea's presence. She scowled and retreated behind her bangs while her sister gleefully exposed her villainy. "She opened the door," Bella said. "They were her keys, not mine." The shock of betrayal from Azalea cracked 2 windows. "Why does Azalea have copies of the door keys?" Kuro asked. Unlike her sister, Azalea wasn't prone to criminal activities. She was fixated on the honor of her family name and wouldn't dare tarnish it. Azalea attempted to seize control of the conversation. "For emergencies," she said, with the tone of someone trying to dig themselves out of a lie. "Like this one." A broad, mischievous grin spread across Bella's face, and she maintained unwavering eye contact with her furious little sister as she argued the claim. "She wanted to see where you went every night," said Bella. "How do you know I sneak out?" Kuro asked. He knew nobody had seen him. He could tell when people were looking. It was a skill he'd honed in his years as a street thief. "I go for walks when I can't sleep. Autolycus sometimes joins me. He's been missing lately. I got suspicious." Kuro's familiar wasn't there to defend himself, as he'd been dragged off by the lost child. Someone else, however, was present and listening. "Suspicious of what?" The voice was a low growl, and managed to be simultaneously curious and accusing. The 3 orphans shuddered. If anything could unite the trio, it was the owner of that voice, their common enemy. They turned to find him leaning against the doorframe to the kitchen, having snuck in the back without making a sound. He was unshaven. His long green coat, weathered and unbuttoned, billowed in the wind. It was the kind of casual disregard for uniform that only the highest-ranking officials could get away with. Clutching a steaming cup of coffee in a tin mug that looked to have come out the wrong side of a war, he peeled himself away from his leaning post and gave a gentle bow. "Ladies Lamorak," he said, in an obvious effort to be formal, almost succeeding in making the greeting not sound like a threat. "Knight Commander Dubois," returned Azalea with a slight nod. She adopted a comically rigid posture, as if standing straighter would make up for Dubois towering over the girl. Bella made no such overtures. "Morning, Talon," she said, and slouched more deeply into a dining room chair. The greeting between Dubois and Kuro went unspoken. Just an anguished glance to acknowledge that neither wished to see the other, and a resigned shrug in recognition that neither could do anything about it. "Why," asked Dubois, "can I not go a summer without seeing you 3? Somehow, when I was woken up before dawn, I just knew it was you lot." Bella raised a finger in protest. "Don't be like that. We're the good guys this time. Properly heroic knightly business. Rescuing innocents in distress and all that. We deserve medals." Dubois demonstrated a remarkable ability to slurp coffee dubiously. The precise rhythm, duration, and tone of the slurp indicated a profound suspicion of anything the young woman said. Rather than addressing her claims directly, he took a different angle. In the course of your heroic nightly business, milady, could you explain what required you to unleash enough lightning that this place still stinks of it? Bella smirked, eager to engage in Dubois' games. She was denied the opportunity as a young officer in red stumbled into the room and snapped to attention, nearly giving herself a black eye with an overzealous salute. "Sir," she said briskly, and then waited, frozen in place, for Dubois to acknowledge her. Dubois looked to the children he was meant to be interrogating with weary eyes and let out a long sigh before addressing the woman. "What is it, Tremblay?" "Sir, yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We have a problem, sir." She stood straighter with each "sir," to the point that it looked like her head might pop off. "Go on," said Dubois, after it became clear that she wouldn't continue without express permission. "There's a bog sloth prowling outside, sir. It appears injured. Electricity burns." "And?" Dubois snarled. "What should we do, sir?" the junior officer asked. "Chase it off." The suggestion seemed to terrify her almost as much as having to speak directly to Dubois. "Oh, sir." "Are you and your partner not both powerful wizards, with polar bear and moose familiars at your disposal?" "Sir, yes, sir." She continued to stand, frozen in salute, despite her hair blowing in her mouth and eyes. Dubois' impatience bubbled over, and Kuro thought for a moment he might use the young redcoat as bait for the bog sloth. But a long draw on his coffee soothed him enough to level his tone into a rough snarl. "Use your imagination. Just try not to hurt it any more than it already is." "Sir, yes, sir." She dropped her hand just long enough to start a new salute. As she marched awkwardly out of the dining hall, Bella shouted after her. "Good to see you again, Lexi." "Friends?" Dubois asked. Sort of. I know her from school," said Bella. "But didn't she just graduate? What's she doing here?" "New recruits, all of them," replied Dubois, with a weariness that betrayed his feelings for them. "Just finished basic training." "From the sounds of it, you should send them back." Dubois was unable to contain a genuine chuckle, and any hope he had of maintaining his role as interrogator shattered. "The bog sloth, your handiwork?" he asked. Bella nodded. "Was it really necessary to zap it that badly?" Bella shrugged. "That depends how many pieces you want Kuro to be in." Kuro did not enjoy the attention turning to him. He had been having a fine time watching Bella and Dubois annoy each other, and had no interest in getting involved. "So, what were you doing outside the walls at night?" inquired Dubois, though it was said as more of an indictment than a question. "Just going for a walk," said Kuro. "Not escaping?" The food's too good here." Dubois chuckled. "So you could have slipped away down Zephyr Way or into the Blandlands at any point this summer, and you stayed for the food." "Have you ever gone hungry?" Kuro asked as his explanation. "Besides, you would have found me eventually. It's what you do." Dubois incorrectly took the statement as a compliment, bowing very slightly in a show of false humility. His moment was somewhat undermined by the entrance of another of his trainees. He looked too young for the long green uniform coat and moved like he was afraid to dirty or damage it in case the true owner found out. He was trailed by a beagle with its head low and tail between its legs. Kuro thought he recognized the boy but couldn't quite place him. Sir," the boy mumbled. Dubois squeezed his eyes shut and took a long, cleansing breath. "What is it, Patterson?" The boy gulped twice as he prepared himself to deliver the bad news. "We can't find the Lostling's trail," he said. "Nothing anywhere around the orphanage." Dubois looked to Kuro as if hoping the boy could save him from the incompetence of his new recruits. "I carried him," Kuro said. "I found him in the road on Zephyr Way, towards the western wildlands. Maybe a 10-minute walk? I marked the spot in chalk." The young man nodded and made a hasty retreat before his commander could berate him for needing the help of a junior high school student. As he left, Kuro caught sight of Bella, who was staring, mouth agape, at the exiting hound. After a few moments, as she fought between confusion and fury, she rounded on Dubois with an accusing finger. "You hired Seth?" she demanded. That was Seth, Azalea sneered, making no effort to hide her disapproval. Your ex-boyfriend? Kuro knew he had recognized the boy. He was the other shoe thief, Bella's partner in crime. He looked different with close-cropped hair and an official uniform. Dubois shrugged innocently. His beagle's got a good nose, he said. But you arrested him, screeched Bella. He's a criminal. If we refused to recruit anyone who did something irresponsible as a teenager, the entire Royal Guard would consist of 3 ledgers and a large pot of coffee. Bella was unconvinced. Would you take me? Dubois was clearly enjoying her fury and chose to fan the flames. Of course not, milady. I would not insult a future Knight of the Sun with such a plebeian post. Would you hire him? Bella asked as she thrust a finger in Kuro's direction. In a heartbeat, said Dubois. He took a slow sip from his cup to let Bella brew before adding, He'd never take the post, though. Food's terrible. Then he winked at Kuro. He actually winked. The whole interaction had been extremely strange. Dubois couldn't seem to decide whether he wanted to level threats or make jokes. Bella vacillated wildly between shouting and bragging, and Azalea had been all but silent for the whole exchange. It wasn't until the unsettling wink that Kuro realized what was going on. They weren't in trouble. They had done nothing wrong. More than that, they were all on the same side. Not one of the people in the room knew how to talk to each other in that situation. Enemies in a years-long feud found themselves with nothing to fight about, but had no practice interacting in any other way. It was deeply uncomfortable. They were rescued from any further attempts at friendliness by the return of the lost child in the arms of their new caretaker, Sabine Elissar. She was technically also a member of the Royal Guard, but she was only a ledger and an unusual one at that. She was a member of the department responsible for the care of lost and orphaned children. So far as Kuro could tell, she was the entire department. She wore her gray uniform jacket, but it was used more to absorb tears and drool from younger children than as a mark of authority. It hung unbuttoned over a flowing lilac dress, which had a matching scarf she'd wrapped around her head. He isn't causing you any trouble, is he? She asked with a gentle tone she used to soothe toddlers and guardsmen. Not at all, replied Dubois. He's being uncharacteristically helpful. I'm sorry, Talon, Sabine said sweetly. I wasn't speaking to you. She gave a conspiratorial smile and a slight nod to the assembled children. Well, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I was about to bring Evan here to Bytown, and we wanted to say goodbye to his rescuers, didn't we, Evan? She encouraged the tired and traumatized child to unbury his face from her shoulder and release his grip on the raccoon. Want to wave goodbye to Kuro and let him take care of Autolycus for us? Evan clearly wanted neither of those things, but through the gentlest urgings, Sabine was able to pry loose Kuro's familiar. Once freed, the raccoon scrambled clear of the child's reach. Sabine laughed and thanked everyone on Evan's behalf, including Autolycus, who was uncomfortable with praise and hid his face behind his paws. Thanks for your help, Sabine, said Dubois. We'll let you know what the sniffers turn up. Bella took Sabine's exit as a vehicle for her own escape. We'll walk you out, she said as she stood up and nudged Azalea and Kuro to do the same. While none of them looked to Dubois for permission, he provided it nonetheless. Go ahead, we're pretty much done here, except Kuro. I have a couple unrelated matters to discuss with him, if he'd be willing to stick around for a minute. All 3 women stopped and looked at Kuro with slightly raised eyebrows, waiting for something from him. It took a moment for Kuro to decipher the gesture. They were offering to stay. All 3 of them. To defend him. Sabine, he understood. But the sisters? That was not a direction from which Kuro would have expected aid. He shook his head slightly. He wasn't in any danger. If Dubois were going to make Kuro disappear, he would have already done so. Besides, Kuro had some questions of his own. He sat back down and waited as the others left. Dubois put down his now empty coffee cup and stretched as if just getting out of bed. Then he started to walk in a slow, casual circle around Kuro, with his coat flowing dramatically in the wind. You called your familiar Autolycus? He asked. Legendary trickster? Son of the god of thieves? Seems a bit ostentatious, don't you think? The question seemed an unlikely reason to hold Kuro back for a private conversation. He assumed it was the opening move in the game of verbal chess Dubois so enjoyed. If so, Kuro already felt at a disadvantage. He hadn't known the origins of the name. "No, of course I didn't name him that," replied Kuro. "Then who?" "Azalea," Kuro said flatly. "Who else?" Dubois laughed as though the story was one he knew well. When Kuro raised an eyebrow, the hound explained. "Do you think I named my familiar after the harbinger of Ragnarok?" Kuro chose not to acknowledge that he thought Dubois was exactly the sort of person who would do that. "Some kids at school started calling him Garmer, and the name stuck." He reminisced as he continued his slow circle around where Kuro sat. "Where is Garmer anyway?" Kuro asked. It was unusual to see the hound without his huge wolf familiar at his heel. "Out with the new pups, making sure they don't mess things up too badly," Dubois answered with an accompanying eye roll. "They have great noses but haven't learned where to point them yet. If I left it to Joseph, poor little Evan would be in our care until he started shaving." "What will happen to him?" "Most likely he'll be back home before the end of the day," Talon said with a hint of genuine pleasure. "We've people on the outside watching for news of missing kids, and you've left us a trail to track back, so we'll know where he crossed over. Someone will keep an eye on him in case he's got a knack for wizarding, and maybe he'll be at Avalon in a few years. Most likely, though, he'll just go home to his folks, and this will all seem like a bad dream." "Will you take his memories?" Dubois shook his head. "From a 3-year-old? Not worth the bother. Kids that age imagine all sorts of nonsense." The hound completed the wide circle he'd been walking around Kuro. As he did, there was a subtle shift in the room. The quality of the air changed, becoming thicker. Sound stopped traveling as far, and there was a feeling that they were in a much smaller space. Satisfied with his spell, Dubois stopped feigning friendliness and fixed Kuro with a penetrating stare. "That should keep eavesdroppers out. We have some things to discuss." "Agreed." Kuro did his best to return the gaze, but due to old orders not to talk to people, it landed slightly to the left and he spoke instead to a fairy-light sconce on the far wall. The combination of unexpected consent and the off-target glare gave Dubois a moment's pause. "Did you want to go first?" "I'm fine. I'm sure your stuff is more important." Kuro tried not to sound annoyed or impatient, but the result was it sounding condescending, as though the hound were a bothersome child. This, too, unsettled Dubois, which he countered by shifting to his more comfortable state of being, a hunter. "What have you told people about Dr. Vincent Penfield and the events of last year?" he demanded. It was a question, an accusation, and a threat all rolled into one, and Kuro found it comforting. This was the Talon Dubois he knew and loathed, the legendary predator, the pet wolf of the Royal Guard. After a long and difficult night, it was much easier to navigate their customary relationship than try to deal with a Dubois that cared about lost children and laughed at jokes. Not much," said Kuro, settling into his usual role of evasive defensiveness. "Why don't you ask Arthur? He wrote down everything I said." It was true. When Kuro had explained the events of the prior year, Arthur had taken meticulous notes. He had insisted that Kuro describe the resolution to the burglaries in detail. Kuro had obliged, giving explanations as to how Vincent, posing as a servant, had smuggled in his captive Luton, Bindle, to collect blood samples of every student at the school in hopes of finding the heir to the Tirnanog throne. Kuro had focused on the details about how Bindle had been forced to help, how Vincent was just a hapless Blandlander, manipulated to search out the missing heir, but then abandoned for a decade as his masters were all arrested. He had skipped over one detail quite intentionally, which he had agreed with Dubois was unimportant and dangerously misleading. The doctor's tests had yielded a positive result. There was someone with royal blood at Avalon Academy. Kuro was the only person with any memory of that fact, and Dubois was the only person he'd ever told. There was no way to know if the test was valid, and good reason to believe it wasn't. Besides, if the summer heir really was attending Avalon Academy, they were doing so in secret. They had been in hiding for more than 14 years, and Kuro wasn't about to endanger that. Unlike some people, he respected others' wishes for privacy. The hound tapped his index finger on the edge of the table against which he was leaning while he contemplated his next move. That he didn't immediately interrogate Kuro further on what details he had provided to Arthur exposed that Dubois had already asked him, or, more likely, read his notes. "You've spoken to no one else about it," he confirmed. "Who would I talk to?" replied Kuro. "Nobody cares what I have to say, and they wouldn't believe me anyway. Why are you asking?" Dubois weighed the benefits of sharing information with the young thief, seeming to meditate on whether he would be more useful with or without additional knowledge, and which pieces would yield the result preferred by the Royal Guard. "There has been renewed demand to search for the missing heir to the Summer Throne," he said at last, "and rumors that the child is a student at Avalon." He paused, examining Kuro's reaction before adding, "Nothing substantial. Nothing claiming knowledge of their identity or inside information into Vincent's plot. It could just be coincidence. This happens on occasion, usually when the Tirnanog nobility starts squabbling or a popular book on the subject gets written. But the timing is suspicious." He would have added more, but the wind chose that moment to change direction and blew his hair into his eyes. He cried out in aggravation as he tried to blink away the discomfort. "Why is it so windy in here?" he growled, as if accusing the air itself before turning his displeasure on Kuro. "Are you doing this?" "Sort of," Kuro replied. "Could you stop it?" Dubois held back his hair while trying to find a location where the breeze was more favorable. "I can't, actually," said Kuro, making no attempt to hide his satisfaction that Dubois was also now suffering. "It's what I wanted to talk to you about. What exactly does this do?" Kuro held up his right arm, exposing the silver bangle covered in runes, which shimmered like a thin layer of oil on water. "Like I told you, it's an anchor. It stops Luton from blinking." It was Kuro's turn to accuse the hound, and he reveled in it. "You said it does that among other things. What other things? The wind doesn't move me anymore, and a bog sloth bounced off me like it ran into a mountain." Dubois sighed and resigned himself to providing a full explanation. It took some time for him to organize the words, though, as it was so against his nature. "It is an anchor, but they weren't intended for Luton. They were developed to keep riders on their mounts so they don't get knocked off in battle. It's a complicated enchantment letting whatever you're riding move you, but something else not. What exactly counts as moving and being moved is hard to define and depends a lot on the intentions of the enchanter. They don't exactly work as designed. Keeping Luton from blinking was an unexpected side effect. None of that explains why it's so windy, though." "I think she's upset that she can't help me," replied Kuro. "She's been like this since last night when she realized she couldn't speed me up, and I can't get her to stop. Could you take it off, just for a few minutes, to let her calm down?" Dubois ran his fingers through his hair, trying to restore it to its intentionally tousled state, rather than the wind-blown mess it had become. "I'm gonna act like any of what you just said made sense. No, I can't take it off. And I don't mean that I don't want to or I refuse to. I mean I actually can't. Not unless you want me to remove your whole hand first." Kuro considered that possibility. While he favored his left hand, he wasn't keen on losing his right. On the balance, not getting help from the wind was probably the preferable option, but not by much. "I am sorry," Dubois insisted. "It was the least terrible option I could manage." He said it with his usual sense of absolute authority, as though it were an order that Kuro was meant to accept without question, rather than an apology. That bluster drained out of the hound, however, and a look of genuine remorse took its place. "There is one other thing," he said, now evading Kuro's gaze. "Beatrice Crawley stood trial a few days ago." Though the wind did not abate for a moment, it felt like all the air had left the room. Ms. Crawley had helped create Kuro, been his best teacher, rescued him from Phineas, and then been arrested because of it. She had spent the past year under house arrest while important people argued about what to do with her. We tried to get her remanded to Avalon, Dubois continued, to work there without pay as a form of community service in recognition for her cooperation. Many of the nobility called for her execution. Conspiring to overthrow a kingdom isn't something they forgive easily. The word execution hit Kuro harder than the bog sloth. If he hadn't already been sitting, he would have collapsed. And the only thing keeping him from throwing up his breakfast was that he hadn't had any. We managed to meet in the middle, but that's still an extended stay in Niflheim prison. It had taken mere seconds for Dubois to clarify that Ms. Crawley was not headed for the gallows, but in that time, Kuro had all but committed to overthrowing a kingdom himself. I promised her I'd let you know. Also, I can get letters to her if you wanted to write. They'd be inspected by the guard, of course, but I think she'd enjoy hearing from you. It can get lonely in there. He spoke without any of the smug superiority Kuro had grown accustomed to. There was no hint of cunning or manipulation. His posture had faltered as well, still leaning against the table, but rather than him holding it in place, it was instead the only thing keeping Talon from sinking to the floor under the weight of the news he was delivering. How long? Asked Kuro. Dubois didn't meet Kuro's eyes. With good behavior and some help from the outside, she might get out before you graduate high school. That wasn't a comforting answer. It wasn't clear how long it would take Kuro to graduate, or whether he would manage it at all. At a minimum, that would be nearly 4 years away. He voiced only his second concern. Who would help her? Dubois took that as some kind of insult. The weariness and sadness fell away and the hunter returned in full force. This is not justice. The nobility have flexed their muscles and made their point, but they have short attention spans. The guard, on the other hand, has a long memory and doesn't like to lose. The grim certainty pouring off the hound gave Kuro hope. There was a promise in it that Dubois would pursue Ms. Crawley's freedom with the same relentlessness as he would a street thief from Detritus. Just as clear was that this was a long hunt, one requiring patience and guile rather than ferocity. Kuro nodded his understanding. Dubois pushed himself up from the table and thrust his hands in his pockets, assuming his normal guise of unkempt authority and shaking off the remnants of his brief attempt at humanity. Good work rescuing Evan, he said, as though encouraging one of his new recruits. Enjoy the rest of your summer and try to stay out of trouble. Maybe give those ribs a chance to heal. With luck, we won't see each other again until Dock Day. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.